Welcome to the Brass and Woodwind shop. There are different ways to cut metal on instruments and on parts that are to go on instruments. If you're cutting tubing, the best way to cut it is to use a tubing cutter. If you want to watch that video, the link is in the description below. However, you cannot use a tubing cutter on everything, so I will show you how to cut metal when you cannot use a tubing cutter. If you cannot use a tubing cutter, the best tool to use is usually a jeweler's saw, and that has blades that you can remove easily. And you can swap out the blades. These blades are very thin and they make a very fine cut, but they do break easily, so you will probably need a lot of these blades. They're different blades. I will show you a couple here. This is the coarsest cut, and even that is a very fine cut, but it's the coarsest one on a jeweler saw blade. And this is a very fine cut. It's extremely narrow and extremely thin, and these are the ones that you break the most of. And if you're cutting on an instrument, usually you want to take off as little material as possible, so usually you would use this blade if you can. If you're not cutting on an instrument and you do not need to be quite as careful, then you can use something thicker, maybe not this thick. I have several different sizes of jeweler's saw blades, and I use the larger one, the more coarse one, if I'm cutting something that does not really matter how much material I'm using up. And I will use the finest one if I need to be very careful not to remove very much of the metal on it. Also, the finest blade works well on very thin metal, and that's because the teeth are so close together that they do not get stuck as easily in between the very thin metal. The tubing cutter works very well on straight tubing. However, if you need to cut curved tubing, the tubing cutter will not work on that, so you would use the jeweler's saw on that one. Also, if you're making a patch, like with something like this, you would want to use the jeweler's saw blade on that, and you would use the thicker jeweler's saw blade because there's a lot of metal there. If you use the finest jeweler's saw blade on this, you would probably break several, and also would take you a long time to cut through something like that. So you'd probably want to use the thicker one on this one. Also, you would need the jeweler's saw blade if you're making a piece out of stock brass. I'm going to cut a patch off this piece of bogard. So what I'm going to do is use the coarsest saw blade. On most saws you would install the blade so that you're cutting when you're pushing forward. However, on this one, on the jeweler's saw, turn it around, you actually are cutting when you're pulling backwards on this one. Take the saw blade and put it into the slot, and then put it in the other one and tighten that. If you do that, the blade is a little loose, so what you do is you unscrew this, push it with your thumb, and then tighten it up. And that makes the blade tight, so it's less likely to break. I put the piece of metal in the vise, and I marked where I want to cut it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the blade on there. I'm going to start it with my finger so that the blade does not slide around. And then when you cut, go back and forth. Do not push too hard when you do this, because if you push too hard it will break the blade. Because the coarse blade is thicker, it will be less likely to break, but it still can break easily if you push down too hard on it. So just let the blade do the cutting. And usually it takes a while to cut this. Okay, now it's almost all the way through. And now the blade's having a hard time because the teeth are getting caught in there because the metal is thin. Okay. There it is, and the metal has some burrs and sharp edges on it where I cut it. So I'm going to clean that up with some files. I have the flat one that I'm going to use on the outside of this, and then I have a rounded one that I'm going to use for the inside. This is cleaning up the rough edges so that the piece is not so sharp. I filed down the rough edges. If I wanted to smooth this out more, I could use the buffing machine and buff this piece out. Now I'm going to cut on the curved portion of some tubing, and the metal is very thin, so I'm going to use a fine blade on this. I'm going to loosen these two screws to take out the blade, and then I'm going to install the fine blade. Put that in there. And then tighten up the other screw. And then again, I'm going to loosen this up, push this with my thumb, and then tighten it up. And make sure that the blade is tight in there. I put the tubing in the slide expander to hold on to it while I cut. And now I'm going to cut right here, along here, and I'm using my finger to guide me for when I get started. There we go. So I'm cutting this tubing, and I'm trying not to put a lot of pressure on it. You can see that the blade is kind of catching. The reason why is the metal is very thin, and because of that it can get stuck in these teeth. When I'm cutting, I'm letting the blade do the work, and I'm just going back and forth trying to make sure that it does not get stuck. Once you get over halfway through, it gets a lot easier to cut without the metal grabbing the blade as much. So I'm just going to finish cutting. And again, on the tubing, I need to clean up the rough areas on here. So I'm going to do that with the solder scraper, or also known as a triangular knife. And then clean up the outside of the tubing, like that. And there it is, the cut is done. I hope this video has been helpful. Please subscribe for more band instrument repair videos, and look in the description below for links to other related videos.